Mexico's foreign minister has accused the United States of double standards after Washington refused to invite the leaders of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua to the Summit of the Americas. The Mexican president, López Obrador, is skipping the event and will be meeting President Joe Biden at the White House in July. Washington decided not to invite leaders from the three countries over concerns on human rights. Here's Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro reacting after he was kept off the guest list.
What the US government is doing is an act of discrimination against three peoples, against three governments. We want to say that the meeting that's going to take place in Los Angeles, whether the government of the United States wants it or not, will have the voices of the rebel peoples of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Our voice will be there in different ways, in different forms.
We can now bring in Ryan Berg, Senior Fellow in the Americas Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Good evening. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24 tonight. Now, Mexico's president, among others, had threatened to boycott the Summit of the Americas if the leaders of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua were not invited. So why then did the Biden administration continue and keep these three off the guest list?
Well, thanks very much for having me. I think the Biden administration here is right. They took a principled stance against inviting dictators repressive dictators to a summit that is really about celebrating democracy and talking about how do we consolidate democracy in the region, how do we fortify it, where do we go moving forward from here after a terrible COVID experience in the region. And really, I would add that this was less a U.S. decision than it was a U.S. decision to uphold what had been a consensus opinion throughout the region. At the 2001 Summit of the Americas in Quebec City, all countries in the region signed a resolution that said a rupture in the democratic order of any one of those countries would be an impediment to future participation in a Summit of the Americas. And so really, I think this is just upholding what had been regional consensus as opposed to a unilateral decision on the part of the United States, as López Obrador and other governments in the region are making it sound.
I understand what you're saying, but wasn't the goal of this summit, which is hosted in by the United States, for the U.S. to reassert its leadership in the region?
And precisely by looking at ways in which democracies can work together very cooperatively and creatively to address all of the mounting challenges in the region, I think that the administration has recognized there's something very important about some of the challenges that are facing democracies. I don't see much of what could be offered by having Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela at the summit, quite frankly. I think that they would be spoilers. Unfortunately, the messaging around this from the administration was not very effective. And unfortunately, the pre-summit plans were pretty much hijacked by some countries in the region to make this point about the guest list as opposed to building out a robust agenda.
But Ryan, I just want to interrupt you there, because how does the U.S. plan on tackling issues like migration, for instance, without the president of Honduras at this event?
Well, it certainly is a diplomatic snub not to have the president of Honduras at the event, not to have the president of Mexico at the event. But as you said in your introduction, he's visiting the White House in July. And so I see this more as political theater and as an ideological messaging point, as opposed to a real difference of opinion with the United States. He's coming, like I said, to the United States in July to talk about migration. He said that this morning at his Mañanera. So there's also another migration story that needs to be discussed around the region. It's not just the migration story of migrants showing up on the southern border in the United States. It's the 6.5 million migrants that have been pushed out of Venezuela, the dictatorship precisely that we're not inviting to the summit because they can't find food, they can't find shelter, they can't find safety in that repressive society. And they are mostly in Latin America and the Caribbean region. That's another major migration story that needs to be addressed. 100,000 of whom are actually looking for safety in López Obrador's Mexico. In my opinion, it's a shame he's not going to be there constructing and being constructive with the dialogue at the summit.
But by focusing on just keeping ties or contacts with just democracies in the region, doesn't the U.S. risk, losing out to say, China, for instance, in the region?
Well, I think it's important to note that the region has made a unique commitment that's unlike any other region in the world in the 2001 Inter-American Democratic Charter to uphold the right of democracy for the peoples of the Americas. That's Article 1 of the Charter. This is extremely unique, and I think it's a major principle of Biden administration and indeed U.S. foreign policy toward the region is to strengthen democracy. So it's an important thing to note that most of the countries in the region are democracies. They have peaceful transitions of power. They have competitive elections. And this is something that the U.S. for a long time has felt is a strategic strength of the region, something we should look to build on. And one of the things that actually makes U.S. relations with the region easier most of the time because we relate on a values basis.
I understand that very briefly that you said that the United States only wants to deal with democracies in the region. But in a couple of weeks' time, the U.S. President Joe Biden is going to be in Riyadh at a time when the U.S. needs Saudi oil. There were also talks, rumors that the U.S. was in touch with Venezuela during this crisis with Ukraine to tap into Venezuela's oil supplies. So aren't there double standards on that front?
Indeed, and I criticized the move at the time that it took place because I think it opened the door to this kind of political theater that we've seen. It was a strategic mistake, a blunder, I called it, to go to Venezuela, which can't increase its oil output anyway because the country's economy is in such decline and the state of the oil industry is so decrepit at this point in time. So I called that out as a strategic mistake at the time, and indeed, I think it opened up the door to this kind of political theater. The other thing that I would say opened up the door to this kind of political theater is the fact that, regrettably, the agenda is not as robust as it should be. And so there are some leaders, of course, in the region who took the opportunity to credibly threaten their absence at the summit because they didn't feel as though there were any benefits to be gained there. But the two principal points about being a part of a club, and the Summit of the Americas is really a club, the first is that there should be principles for participation, and the second is that there should be benefits. The administration has been strong on the principles for participation, and we'll have to see what happens in the next couple days on the benefits.
Indeed. Ryan Berg, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us on the program tonight.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.